All right, so today we're going to crack open a really big one of the 20th century's most important and frankly most challenging books on political philosophy, Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies. Now you got to remember when this was written. We're talking the absolute darkest days of World War II. So this wasn't just some academic paper. No, this was an intellectual weapon, forged to defend the super fragile ideals of freedom and reason against, the forces trying to burn civilization to the ground.
So, Popper kicks things off by asking a deeply uncomfortable question. I mean, think about it. We're all taught to look up to the great thinkers of the past, right? The Platos, the Hegels, the Marx of the world. But what if their ideas, as brilliant as they might have seemed, actually contain the seeds of tyranny? What if just blindly respecting them is actually a huge danger to us?
And that's Popper's central point. He's basically saying, look, great men can make great mistakes. He argues that some of the most celebrated thinkers in all of history actually laid the philosophical groundwork for totalitarianism. Now, his goal isn't just to tear down heroes for the sake of it. He wants to challenge their ideas head-on, because, as he says, our entire civilization might just depend on us breaking this habit of deference.
Okay, so to really get a grip on this fight for civilization, Popper frames all of human history around one single massive conflict. It's this constant struggle between two totally opposite ways of life, what he calls the open society versus the closed society.
First up, the open society. This is the kind of civilization we're all hoping to build, right? Popper even borrows a line from the famous Athenian Democrat Pericles to describe it. It's a society that's all about individual reason, freedom to criticize, and personal responsibility. It's a place that, in his words, sets free the critical powers of man. And then, you've got its polar opposite. And this is summed up in some pretty chilling words from Plato. The closed society? It demands total submission. It's tribal. It's rigid. The group is everything. And the individual? Well, the individual is basically nothing. Your place in society is decided for you. And as Plato himself says, you should be taught from a young age to become utterly incapable of even thinking about acting on your own. So, to put it simply, Popper sees the open society as this big, ongoing project of modern civilization. It's a society that's always aiming for things like humaneness, reason, equality, and freedom. The key thing here is that it's not a finished product. Not at all. It's this super fragile process that we have to constantly defend against the really powerful pull of its opposite.
And that opposite, the closed society, well, that's basically where humanity came from. Think of the ancient tribal world, governed by rigid taboos and a hive mind mentality. Popper's argument is that the shock of moving from that closed, stable world into the open, individualistic one was a kind of trauma that we've never really recovered from. And that trauma, it's what fuels all these reactionary movements that try to drag us backwards.
So what's the single biggest intellectual threat to this open society? Well, Popper points his finger at one very specific and very seductive way of thinking. He calls it historicism, which is basically the trap of believing in historical prophecy.
Let's break that down. Historicism is the belief that history isn't just one random thing after another. No, it's a grand story with a pre-written ending, like a movie where the script is already finished. Historicists claim that if we can just figure out the hidden laws of history, we can literally predict the future. It basically turns the historian into some kind of prophet.
Okay, so what's the big deal? I mean, why is this idea so dangerous? Well, Popper's answer is simple but powerful. Because historicism lets us off the hook. It relieves us of all responsibility. Think about it. If you believe the future is already set in stone, why would you even bother trying to solve the problems we have right now?
And this logic, it usually unfolds in 4 very seductive steps. Step 1, you believe that history has some kind of secret destiny. Step 2, some prophet or philosopher comes along and claims they've cracked the code. Step 3, they announce what the inevitable future is going to be. A worker's paradise, a master race, whatever it is. And then comes the final, deadly conclusion. Trying to resist this destiny isn't just wrong, it's completely pointless.
And what's absolutely fascinating is how you see this exact same pattern pop up in totally different ideologies. I mean, the ancient idea of a chosen people fulfilling God's will, that's historicism. The racist idea of a chosen race that's destined for mastery, also historicism. The Marxist idea of a chosen class that will create a classless society, yep, that's historicism too. The details change, but that dangerous 4-step logic, it stays exactly the same.
All right, so now Popper zooms in on the person he sees as the brilliant, but also incredibly dangerous, grandfather of all historicism. And it's one of the most revered thinkers in the entire history of Western philosophy, Plato.
Now, to get Plato, you really have to get the world he lived in. We're talking constant war, plagues, just brutal political chaos in his home of Athens. He literally watched his world dissolve into chaos all around him. And that experience of constant, terrifying change, it made him desperate to find something, anything that was permanent and stable.
His solution was his famous theory of forms. The basic idea goes like this. Everything we see in our messy, decaying world, a chair, a tree, even a government, is just a flawed, imperfect copy. A copy of what? Of a perfect, unchanging, and more real version or form of that thing that exists in some higher, perfect realm.
Okay, stick with me, because this philosophical idea leads directly to a political theory of history. If the original form of a state was perfect, then it logically follows that any change in the real world must be a step away from that perfection. It must be decay. So for Plato, all political change is bad. It's corruption. And that means the main goal of politics becomes shockingly simple. To stop the decay, you have to stop all change. Period.
And believe me, Plato is crystal clear about this. He basically sees change itself as the ultimate enemy. He calls it one of the gravest of all treacherous dangers. He sees it as a poison that corrupts everything it touches. In his view, the only good change is changing something back to the way it was. So what's the result of all this? Well, it's a political blueprint designed for one thing: to freeze society in place. To stop people from disagreeing, he proposes a rigid caste system. To get rid of fights over money among the rulers, he suggests communism, but just for the ruling class. To make sure everyone's loyalty is to the state and the state alone, he even gets rid of the family. And who runs this whole show? An absolute ruler, the philosopher king. Every single part of this system is designed to achieve one single goal: arrest all change. All right, so after that pretty devastating takedown, Popper doesn't just leave us hanging. He doesn't just point out the problem, he actually offers an alternative. He gives us a positive vision for how an open society can and should work. He calls his approach piecemeal social engineering. Yeah, it sounds a little clunky, but the idea is actually very simple. Instead of these massive utopian plans to tear down society and rebuild it from scratch, he argues for a much more modest, almost scientific approach. He says we should identify specific, concrete problems, things like poverty or injustice, and then use reason and evidence to build or change institutions to fix those specific things, one step at a time. So really, this leaves us with a fundamental choice. Are we going to follow the path of the historicist, the prophet, who tells us the future is already decided and that we need these grand utopian schemes to get there? Or are we going to be more like engineers, believing that we can tackle problems one by one and that we actually have the power to make our own fate?
And this quote from Popper just perfectly sums up his entire message. He says, we can become the makers of our own fate, but only after we stop pretending that we're its prophets. Real freedom, real progress, it doesn't come from discovering some secret destiny. It comes from giving up that search and instead doing the hard, practical work of making the world better, piece by piece.
And that's the challenge Popper leaves us with. It forces us to look around at our own world, right now. What are the grand stories about history that we just accept without thinking? Which modern ideas are promising us some kind of inevitable future, whether it's good or bad? If we apply Popper's critical way of thinking, we have to ask ourselves a tough question. Could some of our own most deeply held beliefs actually be the enemies of a future open society?